Greetings. I'm Father Bob Yezel, and I'm retired from Holy Cross Church in DeWitt and also from the Diocese of Syracuse. I'm very excited to welcome you to our new website, especially in light of COVID. So many of us have been hit by that terrible, terrible pandemic. I spent 7 months in hospitals and rehabs. Perhaps you or your loved one has as well. And so today we're finding a new way to come to you, and that's by the website. I pray that this brings you great peace, consolation, and new spiritual insights. During the past year and a half, Father Cliff Auth and Katie Tovar have certainly been running a wonderful program. Father Cliff is from St. Augustine's in Baldwinsville and St. Mary's in Baldwinsville. Katie Tovar, you know, is a standard person at the CARE program. She keeps us together. She's the backbone of the organization. I'm so grateful to both of those wonderful people for keeping the program going and helping us to come to you now via the website. I pray that as we have new speakers and we have some new topics, we can have some new insights. And I'm sure that's going to happen as we come out of the cocoons we've all been in and move on in life. And so we're excited about having you get excited with us and be a part of our community as well. So thank you for being with us today. And thank you for all that you do, and thank you for your prayers. God bless you, and you have a great day.
Well, good day, everyone. My name is Dave Pascinski, and it's my pleasure to have the opportunity to talk with you today. This is being pre-recorded, of course, but I am so glad to have this opportunity at the invitation of some of the people in the program to just present some thoughts to you. And they told me I have kind of a wide range of things that I could talk about, but I know that we're in the realm of talking about aging. Not that any of us know anything about that. I mean, I'm 74 years young a few weeks ago, with all the usual aches and pains, and probably much less than some of you, and maybe others of you that can relate to bad knees and bad ears and a few other things. But it's my pleasure to be with you today and just think about some of the things that perhaps help me and maybe will help you in thinking about how do we continue to negotiate this time of our lives, how to appreciate it, how to survive it with the obvious losses, limits, and hopefully love that we have as part of our lives. So this is my intent today in the next maybe 45 minutes to chat with you about some of these themes and to talk about what makes sense to me, what gives me some meaning in this, and some of the stuff that I struggle with and some of the things that have helped me to appreciate as we continue in this journey. And I guess if I had to find a title or frame this in some way, I'd say this is Teilhard de Chardin's Ideas About Love and About Aging. Now, Teilhard de Chardin is a revered, respected name in Jesuit circles, and I think throughout the world in philosophical and mystical theology circles. Teilhard, as perhaps some of you know, or maybe as others have referenced, was the person who was most responsible for kind of bringing forth this whole kind of atmosphere and dialogue about the future of man, or the future of humanity, as we would probably rename his book today, the phenomena of man, which became the human phenomenon. And he was a scientist and a mystic. He was often suppressed in what he could write about and could not actually publish that much in his lifetime because his ideas were so revolutionary, so personal, bringing God and seeing God in the world and in evolution and in a variety of terms which I won't go into that he talked about. But one of his sayings that I came upon a little while ago was almost uncharacteristically Teilhard, but was a beautiful saying that hit me at this time of life. He died himself of a heart attack in 1955, on Easter Sunday and is buried down at the old Jesuit residence on the Hudson, which is now the site of the Culinary Institute of America, the cemetery behind there, I'm told. But friends have visited his grave and thought about him. But Teilhard, this mystic, this incredible scientist, this paleontologist of world renown, as he grew older in his life, said this. He said, "Growing old is like a gradually increasing penalty for a crime that you didn't commit." And I thought that was hysterical, especially coming from this author whose work was something that we used to ponder when I was in college seminary, when we would talk about his transformative ideas about the future of humanity and his optimism and his centeredness in Christ. So to come upon this quotation, growing old is like a gradually increasing penalty for a crime that you didn't commit, just struck me very, very humorously, somewhat out of context, but it hit home. Because growing old, for many of us, is partly that. Some of us feel old, some of us don't feel so old. Some days we feel very, very old, I imagine. And other days we feel like, yeah, I'm doing pretty well. Perhaps you were reminded of this as I was just a short time ago when President Biden met with Pope Francis in the Vatican. And that encounter was played on television, and it showed the president conversing with the Pope about Satchel Paige. Now, I don't know if that name rings a bell to any baseball fans out there. It's one that I certainly can resonate with. Satchel Paige was an African-American and who was the star, one of the 2 or 3 premier stars of the Negro Leagues in the 30s and 40s. And he finally broke into the majors when they broke the color barrier, first with Jackie Robinson in 1947, and then with him and a few others in 1948. He was one of the greatest pitchers in history, bar none. But at any rate, he was attributed a lot of different phrases. One of his was, "Don't look back, somebody might be gaining on you," which was a great phrase in itself. And I don't know if he originated it, but it's been attributed to him. And the other phrase, which was one that President Biden quoted to Pope Francis, was something where Satchel Paige said, "How old would you be if you didn't know how old you were?" How old would you be if you didn't know how old you were? Boy, that's something I've thought about in different ways throughout this recent years, maybe more. How old am I in my mind? How old would I be if I didn't have these aches or kids that remind me how old I am? Or not able to run like I used to, or any of those kinds of things. But in my mind, I have the wonderful blessing, or in the reality really, the blessing of being with a number of friends who are still very, very close friends from my youth. There's a half dozen of us, guys, that get together nearly weekly for lunch and spend time together in vacation, some of whom I go back to kindergarten with, and all to at least high school, which is more than 50 years ago now. We all had similar backgrounds with ministry or religious life of some sort. So we did have that kind of bond, and we lived in a north side of Syracuse, so we had kind of grown up together, more or less. But the fact that when we're together and we look at photos from 20, 30, 40 years ago, when we were all in great shape and able to run and did marathons together and things like that, it reminds me not just to be grateful, which I am, I hope, and to be present with them and to realize the gifts in my life, but also that sense of saying, how old am I now? Well, I'm certainly a lot older. I'm certainly aging in a way. Some days that feel great, others that are a little challenging. Not nearly as much as perhaps some of you, not nearly as much as many of the people I've known, not nearly as much as some other friends who have dealt with chronic illness or continued illnesses. My own life has had an opportunity to work for many years, about 20, and I still do on call for hospice. So I've obviously done a lot of work and a lot of opportunity to be with people who are dealing with chronic and life-threatening and life-ending illnesses. And I've seen the strength and beauty and suffering and love of so many that I feel it's been a gift to witness. But when I think about this for myself, how am I aging? How am I dealing with this? How am I putting it in perspective? I come up with different answers. I don't have one set perspective, although I'm going to share with you a few of the thoughts that I have. But I don't have one exact key. And I love the story, which I'll share with you right now, about how we don't need to have an exact key. The story is told of the old rabbi in Eastern Europe who was at his school, his shul, for his young students, who was dying. And he was a revered rabbi. He was a genius. He was holy. He was caring. And he's dying. And as was the tradition in those days, in these Eastern European rural places, the rabbinate school was something that a rabbi would simply gather a number of students and teach them both about the Torah and about Judaism and how to be pastoral with their people. And the tradition was when the rabbi was dying or transitioning, the brightest student in the room, or in the school rather, would stand next to his bed and listen for his last words and be able to dialogue with him. And then they'd have the next brightest student, and then the third, all the way through. And in this school of some 15 different students, small group, rural school, the dullest student is the last one in the line. The guy who barely makes it, who has not the greatest experience of the Torah or preaching. And the brightest student asks the rabbi, "Rabbi, what is the meaning of life?" We'd all want to hear this moment. And the rabbi says to him, "My son, life is like a river." The brightest student turns to the next one. The rabbi says, "Life is like a river. Life is like a river. Life is like a river. It passes down all the way through the bedroom, into the dining room, into the kitchen, where the dullest of the students is standing there, half distracted, half asleep." And the person whispers to him, "The rabbi says life is like a river." The dullest student hears this. He turns to the next student and says, who had just spoken to him, What does the rabbi mean, life is like a river?" Passes it back up. "What does the rabbi mean, life is like a river, life is like a river, life is like a river?" Finally, back to the brightest and most promising student who's got daring enough to say to the rabbi, "Rabbi, leader, what do you mean life is like a river?" And the rabbi looks at him and says, "So maybe it's not like a river?" And what I take from that is that sense of this wonderful rabbi in this story who has had a metaphor for his life and a metaphor to share with others that says, life is like a river. And you could certainly say a lot about that. That goes back to the early philosophers, Heraclitus, as some of us remember. But he could be questioned about it. And he could take the question in and say, it doesn't matter who asked this question. He doesn't know it came from the dullest of his students. He just took it in and said, well, maybe life is not like a river, in a sense. Or he said, so maybe it's not like a river. And as I said, I think it points out to me that sense of being willing to learn, being willing to be questioned, being willing to be challenged, being willing to grow and to see other perspectives. That's what I guess I hope for in my own life and in all of ours as we age, that we're willing to listen, to be challenged, and to grow. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't have convictions. It doesn't mean that we negate our own personal experiences or values, or that we think that others necessarily have a particular great truth that they have to share absolutely. But it, to me, does mean that we're open to hearing the questions that come to us from youth, from the world today, from the political situations, from the climate, the world, the environment. We could go on and on about this, about what are the questions that present themselves to us, whether we're 15 or 50 or 74 or 94. I have a friend, and my wife does as well. She's very good friends with this woman. I won't name her, but she's a well-known woman who is 103 years old. And she's been blessed with a life of some health, good health, mentally, physically, emotionally, intellectually, and spiritually. 103. As I tape this right now, she is probably possibly golfing today. She golfs 3 days a week. She's possibly doing something at her church, or she is involved with half mentoring and tutoring yet people in language learning. Or perhaps she's just sitting and writing, which she does a lot as well. Not all of us will have that blessing of health in any of those contexts. But what she has talked about with my wife and my children and myself is the gratitude aspect of her life that has enabled her to keep growing. And what I've witnessed in her when she's been with my own kids who are in their late 20s is that sense of listening to them and wanting to hear from them. Sure, she has a lot of wisdom to impart, and she does that, and sometimes in a way that some people would consider, I won't call it preachy, but kind of on that edge. But it's good wisdom, and I think it's appropriate that she share it. But as I said, the flip side of that is her willingness to listen and her sense always of being grateful. Grateful for the smallest things, grateful for a beautiful day, grateful, as we often say, to get up in the morning, grateful for you name it, and each of us does name it, what gives us gratitude. So as I think about Satchel Paige's remark, which was repeated by the president to Pope Francis, I think about that. What age would I be? Well, there are days where I can still see myself, obviously, running a marathon or playing ball in a different way. And there are days when I can't at all. And some of you are certainly living with greater challenges physically, mentally, emotionally. And we all need to figure out ways that we can continue to be open, grateful, living, much like this rabbi, even on his deathbed, saying, so maybe life isn't like a river. Well, maybe it's not like always the way we say, but it's like something. So I want to talk a little bit about and segue into how do we think about that in terms of a classic paradigm that many of us learned in psychology classes in the past. And those of you that haven't heard of this, bear with me for a minute. And those were the life stages of Erik Erikson. Again, that might ring a bell for some of you, whether or not you've studied him formally or not. But he talked about 8 life phases, basic trust, development, et cetera, et cetera. His last 2 stages he talked about were, of course, that sense of generativity versus stagnation. He'd always put it down as an oppositional thing. So his 6th stage, he's saying people in their middle age life, which he more or less characterized at the time from 40 to 65. We might argue with that some, but whatever. Generativity versus stagnation. And then post 65, again, take that with a grain of salt or adjust it, as the final stage of integrity versus despair. Integrity versus despair. And I'll say a word just about that generativity stage at first there, where that what he was saying, as some of you may recall, or as I recall, was that sense that in our peak years, perhaps, we had a sense that we were able to contribute to the world in a certain way. For many of us, that might have meant family. It might have meant a profession. It might have meant a volunteer commitment. It might have been a personal goal, a challenge to be met in a physical way or an intellectual way, but somehow generating something more for the world, generating a sense of making this world a better place. And as I understood Erikson, it isn't to say that that passes entirely. It's not like we aren't concerned about that yet, but we kind of incorporate it into our being in a different way. So we're not stagnating. We're not just kind of holding on to things. We're not just saying, I've done it all now. Well, maybe there are a few people that have done it all, but I'm certainly not one of them. But that whole sense of generating something. However, probably for many of us, there does come to a point, whether on one of those dimensions, physically, emotionally, intellectually, or in a sense even spiritually, where I feel like I'm not able to generate a lot of creativity anymore. I'm not coming up with some new great idea. Like the rabbi, maybe life's like a river, maybe it isn't. But I am kind of coming to that point of integrity versus despair. And Erikson's insight, which I think is still valuable, was that that is not a permanent state. It's not like all at once you come to say, oh, I put this all together, and therefore I am not challenged with despair or despondency or depression. I think most of us would be dishonest if we said there aren't times where we border perhaps on some of those more challenging emotions or mental states of despondency, despair, or depression. Some of us are blessed to have optimistic personalities or not deal with that particular condition, but not everyone. And even the most optimistic persons once in a while have to wonder, where's this all going? What am I doing? Have I done what I'm supposed to do? But that's where I think Erikson's insights are very helpful. Integrity versus despair as the nexus, the challenge, the day-to-day, well, maybe not day-to-day, but the frequent kind of conflict that we have. I don't want to give in to a sense of the world is going to, where in a handbasket. certainly I can feel that at times, and probably you might as well, with the climate issues. And I still stay very involved with all of that, and I don't think we can in any way minimize that as the premier moral issue of our era. The premier moral issue that has been identified by everyone, nearly every one of the world's leaders, the Pope, spiritual leaders of all traditions. We have to deal with our planet. And it's very easy, I'm sad to say for myself, to fall into some despair about that at times, as active as I am with some environmental issues. But we need to generate and fight against that with a sense of integrity. So what I think, these are components of what Erickson is talking about that give us a sense of integrity. Integrity, as we've often used the word, means truthful, but it also means complete. In other words, as Jesus had said in the parables, be ye perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. Well, perfect in that sense is not a moral quality. It's not like saying, I never make mistakes, or I never sin, or I'm never angry, or I never do things that I'm not so proud about. But integrity means a sense of being a whole person. What makes it a whole? And that is integrity. And that is what I think is our final kind of movement or goal, is integrity. And Erickson says that involves a sense of acceptance. Acceptance. Isn't that tough at times? As I said repeatedly here, a sense of self-acceptance, a sense of the limits, a sense of being not completely who I want to be physically, et cetera, et cetera. But I'm accepting this. I'm working at accepting this, that I can't do all that I did, that I don't get those answers on Jeopardy as quickly as I used to, that I can't even extend myself as emotionally as I would like to a loved one, that I get caught up in my own thoughts, feelings, or just aches and pains more often. But we have to accept that where we are. We're learning that sense of self-acceptance more, and that lends itself to our integrity. That likewise is complemented by a sense, as I said, of wholeness. Wholeness. In other words, I have come to a point, or am coming to a point, because I think it's a journey, not a destination, where we say, my whole being is, in a sense, oriented toward the present and the future. And I will not linger. I will appreciate the past, but I won't linger on the past. One practice, which I don't do enough, but I still believe in and do occasionally, and perhaps some of you do it more regularly in your own life and meditation, is that famous kind of Buddhist practice, which, or it's likewise a Hindu or yoga practice, I suppose, which has been appropriated by Christian mystics throughout the ages as well. And that is with the breath. One Buddhist nun, who is a mystic of sorts, I believe, says, with the in-breath, I take in the present. With the out-breath, I say, it's a wonderful present. With the in-breath, I hold on to the present. With the out-breath, I say the present time is wonderful. That seems like a very simple practice, and one that requires some discipline, however, and one that requires us to have an attitude that says that this is wonderful. The present moment is wonderful. That's hard to believe at times. Hard to believe when we're in suffering or in pain, when we feel the limitation of our abilities or the loss of someone in our lives, or even at times that loss of a sense of God. As we know, Mother Teresa struggled with that. She said, for the last some 30 years of her life, a sense of the loss of the presence of God. That seems incredible when we think about her service and her life and her example. But she had that loss and she lived with it with a sense of wholeness. But this meditation of breathing in the present and saying it's wonderful because somehow the divine is in this present moment is what I hope that I can continue to grow in. A third component of integrity in Erickson's schema is a lack of regret. That seems to me to be a very challenging one. A lack of regret. For years, I think it was very popular for people to cite in their own sense of self Frank Sinatra's song, and maybe some of you love it as well, I Did It My Way. I had always a bad reaction to that song, to be honest with you. I always thought that it could possibly be authentic and true. On the other hand, I thought it sounded like, look at me, I did it my way, boom, that's it. But I won't try to analyze the old Blue Eyes, and probably one of the greatest singers of all time. But the point is, what I'm getting to is that sometimes the lack of regret, he even, in his song at least, he acknowledges that. He said, regrets I've had a few, but then again, too few to mention. Well, I don't think that I would be honest with myself or ever in dialogue with anyone else if I didn't say, I have some regrets. I have some regrets. So, but they hopefully don't paralyze us. Our sense of regret does not trump our sense of gratitude or our sense of wholeness. It more actually illustrates to us that we are fallible human beings. We expected a lot, and that's not bad, I don't think, but we're not going to live up to it all the time. Sometimes in traditional theologies, of course, we've called that fault or sin. I don't want to get into all of that, how we characterize it. But that whole sense of having a sense of integrity and dealing with the regrets and saying, yes, I could have done this differently, better. But I learned, I perhaps am sorry for what was done or wasn't done, and I go on, and I still accept myself as being, Erickson wouldn't say this, but we would in a Christian sense, that I still am lovable. I still am loved by God, and hopefully I feel that with others as well. Not because I'm perfect at all, but because I'm imperfect, because I recognize that I'm human. The other point that Erickson makes with integrity is a feeling of peace. And again, I don't think we need to think of that as a constant state. Some people perhaps are gifted with that or have had the discipline to appreciate grace and God in their lives and love enough to say, I'm always at peace, or I'm always at peace with myself. Perhaps so. But I think for many of us, it might be more of a sense of, I generally feel at peace. I generally feel a sense that I am well, that all is well, as the great Julian of Norwich says in her Shewings of Divine Love. All is well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. And T.S. Eliot incorporates that, of course, in his wonderful 4 quartets at the end of the last of the 4 quartets, where he says, quoting Julian, all shall be well and all manner of things shall be well, where the fire and the rose are one. And in the 4 quartets, that has particular meaning. And I read it as saying action and contemplation, love and loss, sense of wholeness, sense of integrity shall be one. So that sense of peace may come and go a little, but on the whole, it gives us that sense of being able to say, I'm more or less at peace most of the time with what I've accomplished, what I haven't accomplished, what I've done well, what I've done poorly, with the ways that I have been loved or treated people, and some of the ways that I haven't, that I regret, hopefully perhaps have had the chance to ask forgiveness for, and move on from there. And that gives me a sense of peace. The other element that he says, these last two that he puts under a sense of integrity, are a sense of success. A sense of success. And success is something that, again, don't we all want to look back on our life and say, I've had a successful life? But what does that mean? And, probably others in this series and in your own reading and your own life have helped you think about what has success meant to you. Again, it's much like that. It builds on that notion of regret. Sometimes we've had successes. I hope we can all look back in our life and say, yeah, this was well done. This was something that I gave myself to and was successfully completed, or someone else recognized was a successful motion, a successful undertaking, or a successful relationship. But there are going to be some that aren't, plain and simple. But nevertheless, overall, to have a sense of success, that I tried my best. I did the best I could with who I was at the time. I think we've heard that over and over in different other understandings, but that sense of I did the best I could with who I was at the time. Hopefully that gives us a sense of integrity and success. And the final thing under this notion of integrity is feelings of wisdom and acceptance. Wisdom. Well, I don't mean that we've got to be writing a book or even a journal. If you're journaling, that's wonderful. But a sense that I've got the great insight. Again, I return to that story of the rabbi. The rabbi, and to me, illustrates that idea. Here he is being asked to sum up a life that's been successful, and he says it's like a river, and the dullest student says, maybe it's not like it makes him to think, maybe it's not like a river. But he has a sense of wisdom enough to know the difference, as they say, and a sense of acceptance of that, a sense of humor about our own limitations, our own ability to continue to grow and to see, maybe that wasn't such a great insight. That's acceptance. And just quickly to run through that contrast with, as I said, because it's integrity versus despair. The elements of despair that we might recognize, that we might need to try to overcome or let go or fight against, are bitterness. Bitterness. I'm afraid probably I've met people, people, that are consumed with a bitterness about their life or about events. And I'm not saying they haven't had a hard deck or a hard hand dealt to them. I'm not making any judgments about that. I think sometimes of the people I've known where I understand that bitterness at betrayals, at the kinds of unfairness that they might have experienced. But to somehow be able to integrate that and let go so that we're not consumed by a bitterness which leads to a despair. Secondly, that idea of feeling unproductive. That's a tricky one. Because as we get older, for most of us, with the exception of my 103-year-old friend and a few others, we are generally less productive. We generally don't have the energy to produce in different ways. So again, what is the trick in my mind, or the balancing act, is accepting that and saying, yeah, I'm not as productive, but that's okay. I'm not going to let that define me. If we've defined our life by what we produce, then we tend to say, if I can't produce, I don't have a life. And that's what I'm saying, I think Erickson emphasizes. Don't define your life by what you produced. And don't define yourself after you've had a life of some kind of work or something else is saying it hasn't been productive. And certainly that sense of despair would be a sense of depression and hopelessness. And I don't want to go on about that because, again, we all struggle at different times with despondency or depression, some more than others. And I don't minimize the pain of that struggle. But I'm hoping that for most of us, with the acceptance of another person, with the grace of God, sometimes with good therapy, informal or formal, we can get past that and say, you know, this is who I am. This is who I am, and this is what I want to do. So that's what I think Erickson is about. Moving toward my conclusion, there's a couple things I want to say. One is another Jesuit who was a great influence on some of you. You may have read some of his work, or maybe even had the opportunity for a retreat with him, or heard him quoted by others in this series, was Anthony or Tony de Mello, who was a priest, a Jesuit priest from India. I was supposed to have the opportunity to meet him and go on a retreat with him in mid-June 1987. And I was so looking forward to it. And he died unexpectedly June 2nd, 1987. But I've read most of his work since then and spent some time with some others. And there are many, many, many parables in his different books and his whole presence of awareness that I think are worthwhile and have touched my heart. But one that I think of as a life image and life metaphor is this one that I'll share with you. He tells the story of a little bird lying in the middle of the road with his feet up in the air. And up above him circles this raptor, some type of raptor, who's just looking for a dying object or a simple object or perhaps some carrion to eat. And the raptor swoops down and lands right near this bird and even gets him, pins his feet, and he sees the bird is still alive. And the raptor says to him, "What? You're alive? Why are you lying here in the middle of the road with your feet up in the air?" And the little bird said, "The sky is falling. I heard that the other day, that the sky is falling, and I'm lying here to hold up the sky." And the raptor says, laughs at him and says, "Who are you with your spindly little legs to lie here at such risk and put your legs up, and you think you can hold up the sky?" And the little bird looks at him and says, "One does what one can. One does what one can." That is, I think, the kind of adage or the kind of epithet that most of us would want to have. One does that what one can. And whatever our age, whatever our ability, whatever our sense of self, all of that says one does what one can. And that's what I'm hoping I can do. I hope we can all do in that sense. One thing very concretely that helps me on a day-to-day basis think about this is an app on the phone that some of you might be aware of. I'm going to show it to you right here now. It's called the Network for Grateful Living. It's a free app produced by David Stendel-Rast, who is a Dominican brother. And this gratefulness or word for the day under gratefulness for living is something that I get and try to read every morning and spend about at least a minute with, to be honest with you. I'd like to say I spend 5 minutes or 10 minutes, but I don't. Maybe some of you are better meditators than I am. But nevertheless, I do spend at least a minute with it. And this is what he says. For the word for the day for today, courage is the most important of all the virtues, because without courage, you can't practice any other virtue consistently. You can practice any virtue erratically, kind, fair, true, generous. But to be that time after time, you need courage. And that is a quotation from Maya Angelou. So I sat with that this morning a little bit. That was my little meditation of the morning. Where do I find courage? And I can see courage in so many people around me. As I said, struggling with the day-to-day life as well as the larger issues. But that sense of courage, what's going to give me courage? This is a wonderful little app, I think, to help us appreciate that daily living, that daily sense. So we're coming to a point, as far as listening to me, that I think we're about at the end of. But I think what I wanted to share with all of you to come to a point is I began with that quotation of Teilhard de Chardin about growing old being an increasing penalty for a crime we didn't commit. But I want to bookmark this with another wonderful prayer of Teilhard's. And this prayer, I think, sums up something that I leave on my dresser. It was given to me by a priest who has died a few years ago, who went through a great deal of suffering, a great deal of struggle. But he sent me this in the mail some years ago. And as I age, it's something that I particularly think about, this prayer of Teilhard's. It'll take me about half a minute to read it, so please bear with me here. When the signs of age begin to mark my body, and still more when they touch my mind, when the ill that is to diminish me or carry me off strikes from without or is born within me, when the painful moment comes in which I suddenly waken to the fact that I am ill or growing old, and above all, at that last moment, when I feel like I am losing hold of myself and am absolutely passive in the hands of the great unknown forces that have formed me. In all those dark moments, O God, grant that I may understand that it is you, provided only that my faith is strong enough, who are painfully parting the fibers of my being in order to penetrate to the very marrow of my substance and bear me away within yourself. You'd probably need to see this and spend time with it to truly appreciate it. But Teilhard, I think, states that ultimate statement of faith that says, when it's my time, Lord, let me see that you're going to bear me away within myself. And another prayer, which I think many more are much more familiar with, is the famous Thomas Merton prayer. And I won't read that whole thing at this point. It's brief, but he talks about, my Lord God, I have no idea where I'm going. I do not see the road ahead of me. And he says, therefore I will trust you always, though I may seem to be lost, and in the shadow of death I will not fear, for you will never leave me to face my perils alone. And I think in that sense of our struggle against integrity, our struggle of integrity versus despair, our hopes for gratefulness for every day, our breathing in the present moment, and our breathing out saying it's a wonderful moment. What we're hoping for is that sense of being able to say, we are one. Our wholeness is there. our wholeness in ourselves as persons, our wholeness even in our incompleteness is whole in its own way of integrity and in the eyes of God. So thank you very much for this opportunity to share some thoughts with you, and may you have a blessed day. Namaste.
Hey there, my name is Chris Spilka and I'm the director here at Christ the King Retreat House in Syracuse. And I want to thank the CARE program for coming here. They're a tremendous organization. We are excited to host them. Since 1944, we have a tremendous legacy that actually began with the Jesuits over at Lemoyne College, if you can believe it. They began this beautiful tradition here at the Retreat House that carries on to today. In 1994, the Diocese of Syracuse purchased this place for $1 whole. It's the best bargain, I think, in the history of mankind. And since then, we have served as a refuge for many and assisted in their spiritual development. Maybe you are an individual that is really struggling despair and really feeling downtrodden these days. If you're feeling that way, this is a place that is perfect for you. We have many conference spaces and rooms that you can sit, relax, and refocus in a beautifully renovated chapel that you can come pray and talk to the Lord and let these different burdens off your heart. Maybe you're a group leader that is just looking to refocus and recalibrate the mission of your organization. If that is you, then we have 2 beautiful conference spaces in our Merton Room and Loyola Room that's perfect for the size of any group. If you are interested in coming here to Christ the King Retreat House, I invite you to check out our inquiry link on our website, ctkretreat.com. You can click on the inquiry there and you'll be connected with me, and we will book your retreat, whatever it may be. I look forward to speaking with you, and I hope that you'll join our beautiful tradition here and be a part of our history at Christ the King Retreat House. God bless you.